something happened. And when it first happened, it was traumatic and shocking. I don't want to go on at great length, but the creating of a capitalist economy means the creating of a wage labor force. One that is, you'll have to, I'm going to get to language at the end, but I'll bait you a little bit with this. This was the American proletariat who was born, right? You can't have capitalism without proletariat. They go together like love and marriage. Not really, but they have to have proletariat. So now people suddenly began to find themselves without the means. The only means they had to keep themselves alive was their labor power. And that was shocking, that when the market no longer demanded their labor power, they were set adrift. They had no way to survive. Their common lands had long since, by this time, been enclosed. Where they used to hunt and fish was no longer accessible to them, had become private property. They had lost their handicraft. They'd been driven out of business, say, by putting out textile factory workshops, and so on and so forth. A million different ways, doesn't matter how, a million different ways. And they found themselves unemployed. What did they do? They occupied state houses. They occupied land and began to farm it. Because it was unthinkable to them that they could be, it was such a shock to the way they had lived and their ancestors had lived, that they were ready to do things that today seem so drastic to us, but to them seem essential. And that began a long period of resistance that included these kinds of occupations. I don't want to go on too long about this, but let me tell you one thing. There used to be, in late 19th century New York and in late 19th century Chicago and Pittsburgh and elsewhere, this was not unusual. This was not unusual. These were very violent times. You know, we live in a politically pretty pacific society, but a socially very tumultuous one. It's ready to get rough and tough and violent at moments. It always has been that way. There were worker militias that used to parade through the streets of most major American industrial cities, armed to remind the employing class that they were prepared to defend themselves against attacks by either the private armies that were regularly employed, say, by railroad corporations and steel magnates and others, or even against state and federal militias that were often used to break their strikes violently, and so on. This was common, armed worker militias in the streets of New York. In 1877, there's something called the Great Insurrection. It's a continent-wide railroad strike. Shuts down all the trunk lines in the country are shut. And in some places, general strikes break out. One in St. Louis, actually. And St. Louis, Occupy Wall Street occupies St. Louis and runs it for a week. They run it. They just take over everything in St. Louis and run it, actually quite well, until President Hayes sending federal troops to end that. You've all probably heard of Coxey's Army. You know what Coxey's Army was? Right. The Army of the Unemployed. In the 1890s, there's a Great Depression. You know, every 10 or 15 years throughout the 19th century, there are major panics and depressions. That's the nature of a kind of cyclical, free enterprise economy. It tends to do that. And it did. In the 1890s, it was the worst depression of the 19th century. There were many armies of the unemployed. There's another word we don't use anymore, the reserve army of the unemployed. That's a nasty. You're not supposed to say that. But then people, all kinds of people, journalists and novelists, and everybody said, yeah, there's a reserve army. Look at it. It's right out there. It's millions of people who can't work and depress the wage level of those who are. Anyway, these unemployed in 1893 and 94 massed as kind of actual armies, specific ones, and wanted to march to Washington, demand public relief, the opening up of public credit that could then people could have access to start their own businesses, a whole series of demands. Coxey, Jacob Coxey, he was a small businessman in Ohio who gathered together one such army. They marched and they got to Washington, they were ignored. One of those armies, a sizable one, stole a train in Montana and was chased for 300 miles across the Rocky Mountain West by federal troops before it was caught, and the train returned to railroad folk. So there's a long history of this. You probably all have heard of the bonus army, right? The bonus army. The bonus army is an army of World War I veterans who encamped, just like Occupy Wall Street, on Anacostia Flats in Washington, D.C. in 1932, at the very depths of the Great Depression, asking that the pension, which they will be due as veterans of World War I, be accelerated and paid to them as a bonus so they can survive. Right? That's the idea. And they camp out. And days and weeks go by and they camp out. And President Hoover finally decides, like our mayor, he's had enough, and he sends the army. A general like Douglas MacArthur and his I don't know what you call him, his second in command, but I'm sure there's something, is Dwight Eisenhower. And they come and burn down. They burn it down. The tent encampment at the point of the bayonet, and drive these World War I veterans out of Washington. So that's an occupation. It's an occupation. A little bit more tense than what we've so far been seeing. In the depths of the Great Depression, people went and opened up and ran shuttered coal mines and public utilities. It was private property. They had no business being there. They went in and they ran them. All across the United States and major cities, there were movements to stop foreclosures forcibly. That is to say, I don't mean that they shot anybody, but they would forcibly prevent foreclosures of their neighbors by barricading, say, the apartment building that the neighbor was supposed to, or if the furniture was moved out, they moved it back in. Out on the farms, in the farmland, where there was a mass dispossession of farms in Dust Bowl, Great Plains, and so on. There were what called penny auctions, where farmers would gather, and because the sheriff would come to enforce the foreclosure order by the bank and auction off the farm. The farmers would all agree ahead of time that they would bid a penny. They would get the farm and then turn it back over to the farmer. Those were called penny auctions. And then, of course, there is the movement which gives the whole era its esprit and energy, and that is then the labor movement. And what do? They sit in plants and refuse to leave. That is to say, they don't leave the plant and strike. They occupy the plant so it cannot run. Some of the most famous strike, maybe most famous, certainly the most famous strike of the 20th century, is the Flint sit-down strike, which finally brings General Motors to its knees in 1936-37. But actually, there are sit-down strikes all over the country, in department stores here in New York, in steel mills, in rubber factories, and it's what gives birth to the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, and so on. They occupy. This is private property. We know we worship at the shrine of private property, but not then. Not then. They did. They occupied it. And of course, that tradition doesn't end. You remember when people occupied Woolworth? It was a strange place to occupy. They did, yes. And of course we know, and we all pay great respect to that civil rights movement. But that was against the law. That was against the law. Yes. That was It was against the law. Right, for African Americans to sit at that lunch counter in North Carolina, wherever they did, or to ride in front of the bus. They were breaking the law by sitting at the counter or riding on the bus. They were breaking the law. It wasn't some quaint custom or some ugly custom. It wasn't some informal arrangement. It was the law, and they broke it and occupied Woolworths. And of course, there's Madison. We all, I think, are grateful to Madison because in a certain way it prefigured Occupy Wall Street, the occupation of the State House. And let's not even forget Columbia. That was an occupation, wasn't it? 1968. It was an occupation. And the mayor then dealt with it in the way he dealt with it. That was an occupation. Compared to Occupy Wall Street, all of that seems like incendiary, to say the least, compared to what so far has happened. We don't know what will happen in the future, what will be provoked. But I think there are certain lessons I want to draw from that. First of all, and I think the key thing is that, I think a lot of it, is that again and again and again, this kind of mass action, street action, resistance, popular resistance, is the key to change, is the real key to change. I know we're preoccupied with and sometimes think there only is electoral politics, as if the only way, as if the definition of democracy is defined by its weakest expression, which is to vote. It's good to vote, but that's the weakest. Democracy is much more than that, and what these movements of resistance and occupation, if you will, on occasion, show is that whether we're talking about a New Deal or even the creating of the now hated Federal Reserve, what was a reform institution in 1913, or we're talking about, obviously minimum wages or the right to organize or Social Security, all of these things, civil rights most clearly, again and again and again, every major reform epic in American history arises out of that energy that happens outside of, sometimes in concert with, sometimes abetting the electoral process, but apart from it. And that's what's so, I think, inspiring about Occupy Wall Street today. And of course, the other thing about, I think, the lesson you draw from this history of occupations is that it's right to have a healthy respect for the law. The law is, obviously, it's what holds our society together and needs to be treated with great respect. But healthy respect also means to remember it's man-made. To remember it was not given to us, not the laws we're talking about, from on high. It can be unmade. It sometimes is bad law. It need not always be obeyed, and we're grateful to our forebears for not obeying it on various and sundry occasions. And think about it. It was illegal to eat in Woolworths, but it is legal. I mean, it was, or let's say that was illegal. Couldn't if you were African American. It was legal to barter. Illegal. Right? But it's also legal. Credit default swaps are legal. Collateralized debt obligations are legal. They are legal. Right? All of these things, derivatives of it, they're legal. So then what? What does that mean? That we kind of lie down in obeisance to a set of institutions and practices which destroys the country because they are legal? Who are the lawbreakers? Who are the lawbreakers? And I don't mean those who, obviously, a lot of these folks who are just larcenists. They're not going to jail for many of them, but we all know they committed felonies left and right? But I'm not even talking about that, right, where they broke the law. I'm talking about the fact that what they did is legal and shouldn't be. Okay. Finally, very quickly, the last thing, and that is that the accusation is Occupy Wall Street is engaging in class warfare. Yeah. There's a sign I saw today at one of the things I was at this morning. It had two 19th century, one 19th century one I got a kick out of, which was that, the